Greetings all, BWS2K here. I have now restored all the videos on my YouTube channel, I believe. All the links in the comment sections to Google Docs should be working. If you find that there's a problem, then just let me know in the comments, either in that video or under this video or whatever, and there will be a link in this video as well. So let me know if if some of that stuff is messed up and I can fix it, and I appreciate it. And the other thing I wanted to say before we get to the video proper is how much I appreciate the comments and the messages reaching out that so many of you left as a response to my previous video and kind of stepping away for a while. It always helps to have support. It always helps to feel appreciated. And so I covet that. That was really, I appreciate that. So I'm not back on the Discord just yet, and I don't know that I'll ever go back to Twitter. I might just take this opportunity to make that a permanent change in my life. I'm not sure. But either way, I do want to start making videos again as I can. I don't have the kind of schedule I had in the beginning when I started this channel, where I had a little bit more free time. Now I find there are other things taking up my time, but I wanted to pop in here at the beginning and just and let you folks know that I should be returning in some capacity on the horizon in the future, and that I did appreciate all of the support that you all offered, and I return it in the spirit in which it was given. I'm always grateful that folks watch and engage, and even if it's just sending me messages letting me know that you tried out a build, or that you had a build on your own and you wanted to get some feedback on it. I love that stuff. I love all that stuff. So anyway, so thank you for that. Here is the video. I've been wanting to make it a long time. It's long overdue, but you'll see that as we get into it. All right, here we go. So this is a screenshot of a Google Doc from July of 21, and I'll just read it out loud for those of you who might just be listening. Snippets from a July 2021 script for a video that never got made, wherein I started to build what we were from randomly rolling genres and recording my live process. So this is a video that never really got made, but on my channel, you know, there are videos where I've gone through the random generation process for a build, and this was essentially going to be one of those, where I was doing the pick 3 from the Cortex handbook, pick 3 genres, and I rolled. I set them up. I forget exactly how I set them up on tables, but I rolled, and that's how I determined these results. So let me read this snippet here. I've got a 7 and a 1. That's horror and post-apocalyptic. One is not my jam, and the other is very much my peanut butter, my bread, my jam, and my side of chips. I'm looking at an 8, road movie. Okay, first reaction, ugh. Second reaction, I think it's just that one Resident Evil movie with the school bus. But zombies are so overdone. They're basically the ash at the bottom of the stove that you're supposed to clean out occasionally. We can do better. I have a special love for survival games, and the idea of being a nomad is always really appealing for me. Could we be the horror? Having to stay on the move to avoid detection or destruction? I think it has to be something like that. It's not on Earth, we're not humans, the horror has already left, but we're eking out a living in the aftermath. Actually, I like that last idea a lot. Sort of a post-horror-apocalypse. Sounds like what I want is a game that has a bleak dystopian feel to it, full of smoldering ruins and vague memories of what brought this all about, and maybe glimpses into a past when life was much better. I think flashback scenes are going to be critical for some reason. Probably resource pools that need to be rolled at regular intervals. I still really like the idea of not being human anyway, though, and the nomadic lifestyle. Could it be that we're monsters who no longer have a master? Maybe we were once humans, but some great evil turned us into its minions and wiped our memories. With their downfall, we find ourselves no longer controlled, but nonetheless trapped in these new forms, with only the faintest notion that we weren't always like this. Yeah, I dig that a lot. My initial thoughts have me thinking of werewolves for some reason, but I see zero reason to limit the scope like that. Great evils have many kinds of minions. And from there, I started to best guess at some sets and mods, typed it all up, ran it on a couple Friday nights in the server, got great feedback, adjusted, and refined until I arrived at the following present day build, which I will note is not necessarily even its final build. It is just, it has been changed enough over the years, or almost 2 years, that that we are now in what I'm calling 1.0 of a build, which is why I'm making this video now and not a year and a half ago. So I think it's important to understand the context, and this is not something, this was all sort of stream of consciousness when I wrote it out, and in retrospect, I can see a lot of myself working out, working through things that were going on in the world at that time, and that last line really hits home, right? Great evils have many kinds of minions. And so I've shared in some of the videos and on the Discord as well with some of my experience with different communities over recent years. And so I think there was just a lot going into where this concept comes from. It wasn't, I started out not excited for it because I don't really like the horror genre. And road movie is actually something that I rolled a lot when I was doing stuff, and I don't really care for that genre either. And then just as I kind of talked through it and sort of landed on these ideas, some of them didn't survive the resource pools, for instance, you'll see, because that was kind of more leaning on the survival aspect of things, which I kind of dumped. But flashback scenes being critical, that certainly got a big implementation and renamed and reworked and all that. And just that core concept that once it struck me, I didn't ever really deviate. It was more a matter of kind of finding and refining. And then, as I mentioned on this, running playtests over on the Cortex Discord, which was a super help. And for anyone who was involved in that, and there were a lot of you, I super appreciate that. Those were good times, all excellent feedback, but also just good times. All right, so that's a snippet from 2021. So let me pull up the current build here. All right, make sure I can do this. Okay, so what we were, so I'm going to read through it, but I'll stop occasionally and kind of explain my thoughts or where things are coming from or possible changes to, in the future, things that I'm kind of looking at, considering changes. Oh, sorry, that was that's Mrs. BW. Okay, so what we were, a game of monsters and memory. All pages referenced are in the Cortex Prime Game Handbook, version 1.0. What we were is a role-playing game primed by Cortex where the main characters are, and this is in quotes, monsters, just liberated from varied and possibly indeterminate lengths of time in service to a recently defeated sinister evil master who commanded and controlled them against their will to carry out nefarious deeds. Such activity is remembered only dimly, and lives led before being forced into service are a far distant memory, shrouded from clear recollection. Free from dark influence, but still trapped in their monstrous state, the characters must now try to remember their past and reconcile it with their present. While not strictly necessary, this game may touch on themes of trauma, body horror, disassociation, and loss of agency or mind control to some degree. It is highly recommended narrators make use of safety tools such as script change and a session zero to ensure everyone at the table has an enjoyable and positive gaming experience. So this was cut down considerably from earlier versions where I listed some examples that you might play in. So you could go with a fantasy setting. You could do sort of traditional fantasy horror type creatures, but you could also do modern day, or really any time period. You could do the future. You could be rogue AIs. And the more I tried to nail down a default setting, the more I struggled, because I don't think this build is meant to be tied to a specific setting or implementation. What defines monster is going to vary table to table and player to player. And so while there are definitely, and I plan on doing this once I iron out some more, once I get to the place where I feel like this build is stable, doing sort of modules for it for settings with suggestions and bestiaries and that sort of thing. But this heart, this core of what we were, doesn't need that. It isn't required. And then, of course, it doesn't have to become super intense, but it absolutely can be super intense. And some of the games we played were light, and some of the games we played were not so light, but all were ultimately positive experiences. So for our sets, we have attributes, we have distinctions, we have relationships with trait statements, and then we have reversions, which is a new thing that we'll talk about in its own section. And then we have specialties. So attributes are a prime fixed set, meaning if one goes up, another in the set goes down. That's a fixed set. Rated with a D4, 3D6s, 2D8s, and 1D10. So these are the 7 attributes. Instinct is one's awareness, intuition, or gut feeling. Logic is one's ability to receive, analyze, process, deduce, and act on information. Power is one's physical strength, brute force, and the ability to leverage such. Presence is one's social grace and influence. Resolve is one's grit, determination, and will. Speed is one's agility, dexterity, and ability to move with haste. And then vigor is one's stamina, endurance, and fortitude. So contrasting a bit, power being the I am strong and immovable, resolve being more like willpower, and vigor being more like your health, or it's the word. It's vigor. Vigor, right? It's your stamina, ability to run, a long distance, or hold your breath, or resist a poison, or something like that. Okay, so that's attributes. Next set, distinctions, also a prime fixed set. So if one goes up, another comes down, or vice versa. So rated with an array of a D6, a D8, and a D10, they all have hinder. One of them relates to the character's past pre-monster life, and that's going to be rated at a D8, and it has the edit SFX. One relates to their time as an evil monster, and that has a D10, and that has the price SFX. And then one is a song or a poem lyric or a movie quote, some kind of catchphrase, something like that, that the character strives to live by, and that's rated at a D6 with the swap SFX. Now, a common observation about Cortex is that the distinctions all being rated D8 is lessens the importance of the distinctions, the wording of the distinctions, which of course is certainly a way that you can play it at your table, but that's not true because the words matter as much as the rating. In this case, I chose to do variable ratings because there are some things that are going to be more important to begin with. So the fact that you are in this monstrous form has a much greater impact on your character's life at the start. Who they were, in the past, that pre-monster life does have an effect. And then, of course, the song or poem lyric is kind of like the extra thrown in there. But predominantly, from the start of the game, they're not on equal footing in terms of their ability to influence your story that you're telling. The fact that you are in this monstrous form, or that you have done evil deeds, this is going to have a greater impact from the beginning. So you're going to have to kind of reconcile that. And of course, through growth, you can redistribute, change that allocation. All right, relationships. Relationships are a non-prime set, so you're not necessarily going to include them in every role. Rated with a D10, a D8, and as many D6s as needed to have a trait for every other PC, each with a trait statement that can be challenged. And it's not a fixed set either, so ultimately you can have a bunch of really high rated relationships, but they're all going to have trait statements, and you start out with relationships to all the other PCs, which is part of an interesting conversation to have, because if you're coming out of this sort of mind-controlled state, how do you connect with the group that you're in? Is it because they look like you? Is it because you were just fighting? Is it like what is it? Because in my mind, the sort of default setting for this, or not default setting, but default setting as in state of being, is that this is really recent, like 24 hours or less. You've just sort of woken up. So how do you establish those relationships? And I think the trait statements will be really important. But this is, of course, session 0 fodder conversation as well. So lots of good stuff there. And then specialties, which is a non-prime set. And you start with a D6 specialty and 3 steps. Use a step to either step up an existing specialty or create a new D6 specialty. So these are freeform specialties, and it's kind of like Tales of Xadia in the sense of you have a D6 specialty. So I'm going to choose, D6 sword making. And then I have these 3 extra steps. So one of them I'm going to use to step up the D6 sword making to D8 sword making. And now I have 2 extra steps. Now I'm going to spend one of those steps to have a D6 aircraft controller specialty. And then I have another D6, and I'm going to make another D6, or excuse me, I have another step, and I'm going to make another D6, map making. So I have a D8 sword making, D6 air traffic controller, and then D6 map making. However, so you can have a really beefy specialty, but not a lot of breadth, or you can kind of distribute it out and have several specialties, which is something that I'll read the next section, right? Narrators take note. Ordinarily, a Cortex Prime game will have 3 prime sets. Not so with What We Were, as there are enough sets to reasonably get at least 3 dice in a character's dice pool. If characters aren't acting in relation to anybody important to them in some way, or in an area of expertise, or in a monstrous capacity, then they probably aren't acting in a way that will significantly impact the status quo, or the conflict that's going on needs to be redefined, and the role can likely be avoided entirely. The role can be avoided if it's not including those things. Of course, plot points can come in handy, pretty handy, for adding additional dice from a set as well. So, and this is not the only Cortex build to only have 2 prime sets. Marvel Heroic really only has 2 prime sets. So the idea being, between challenging the statements and SFX and various other things that you'll see as we move on, it is entirely conceivable that you can get 3 or 4 dice in your pool without having to say that you always have to use relationship dice or specialty dice or whatever. So distinctions and attributes are really the prime sets. All right, so for mods, we're using crisis pools, dramatic order, growth, no skills, just specialties, rating distinctions, and shaken and stricken. So some of this I've already kind of mentioned, but we'll go over it. So crisis pools, almost all opposition will be in this form, though the crisis pools may have any number of SFX or limits in order to make them unique and enjoyably dramatic. So we're not using the Doom pool. So you have crisis pools, but in order to make them unique, you can kind of play with them. Add in some fun SFX to give them character in the situation. But you don't have to. Dramatic order functions as usual. Players may elect to take turns, but it's entirely unnecessary to do so. In my experience, whenever we used dramatic order, almost always players would sort of go right into a turn order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is nice, but in this case, not necessary. And some conflicts may actually spot PCs differently as lead for the scene, while others take a support role, or they are engaged in a different scene altogether. There were some really great role-playing moments in the playtesting games where, had we not been able to delve into dramatic order, then I don't know that they would have organically come about. So depending on the specific game, there may even be considerable conflict between the PCs at times, which is super awesome to have that interpersonal drama. Dramatic order can be difficult for some players, so great care should be taken to make sure that nobody is feeling left out, and it was just a plug for safety tools, which can be a big help here. The opposite of that idea that people tended to fall into an action order of sorts is that some people without the action order struggle to be heard, and some people are comfortable with that, but not everybody is. So you want to make sure everybody's getting their share of the spotlight in the story. So if you are in dramatic order and there's a lot of really great drama going on, but somebody hasn't spoken in a while, then as a GM, it may be worth kind of pausing and then switching and letting them have an opportunity to speak. But that's just safety tool kind of stuff, right? Good table practice. And then growth. So growth functions mostly as normal. Dice are added when stress is recovered with someone's help. So both parties gain a growth die. And this is according to a section that I have later on. So ordinarily, you would get a growth die if someone helped you. This is not the case here. The case here is you would both, the person being helped and the person doing the helping gets a growth die. Dice are added when stress is recovered when someone's help. When a relationship trait statement is challenged, you get a growth die. And then lending relationship dice. So this emphasizes teamwork above all during tag scenes at the end of a session before growth dice are rolled, if any, if you have any growth dice to roll. Before you roll them, you can do this. A growth die of any size may be spent to add a new one-word recollection. We'll talk about those in a second. A growth die of any size may be spent to add a new one-word recollection to a character sheet. Only one recollection per tag scene can be treated this way. So you can essentially give up a growth die to add this new trait onto your character sheet called a recollection. Or a recollection of 2 or more words can be permanently converted to a signature asset related to that recollection. And it can be renamed or rewritten if desired, if that makes more sense. Rated at a D6 and then stepped up for every word beyond the second. So if you had 5-word or more recollection, then when you convert that, it would be a D12 signature asset. And the idea, and we'll get to recollections in a minute, but the idea is that you have remembered fully realized a memory so well that now there is something about that is a tangible help to you in the form of a signature asset. So whether it's information or an ability to create something or a location or something like that, whatever. No skills, just specialties. Functions as usual. Players choose whatever they like for traits in this set. The specialties that a player chooses must meet GM approval, of course, but it will signal what the player wants to do as well, so GMs pay attention. So if your table is full of players who have all decided that they want specialties like baking and cooking and pie stand assembly and things like that, then probably these folks are trying to tell you that they would like to have a game that takes place largely in some kind of kitchen or is kitchen themed or baking themed or food themed, right? So it's just kind of good practice to be aware of that sort of feedback loop. Rating distinctions, functions as usual. We mentioned that earlier. And then shaken and stricken. So we're using shaken and stricken here on attributes, and we're not using complications. So every affliction that comes out in this build is going to be expressed through stress on attributes, which is why there's so many attributes. All right, next page. There's only 4 pages, and the last page is a character sheet. So this is the last page. So, but these are the new rules. So this is kind of the core of what we were, and really this is the part that I didn't want to leave. And you'll see that this harkens back to what we looked at earlier, that snippet earlier. So what we were implements a few new sets and mods from other Cortex Prime games in order to fully capture the feeling of monster characters trying to remember and reconcile with their past actions. So we have recollections, reflections, reversions, and then we also have the sharing and caring section. So recollections, characters start with a memory in the form of a single word called a recollection. During play, these can be used to provide a plot point for immediate use, similar to callbacks with session records. They can do that by referencing the memory that they are connected to that the PC is trying to remember or apply to their present situation. Each recollection may be used only once this way until it is refreshed during a reflection. So you might choose fire. That's the word you start with. So that means that your character has this dim memory having to do with fire. From the distant past. It could be before they were a monster. It could be during their time as a monster, but it's not a clear recollection. It's there. Something about fire is important. And they're in a scene, and there is a house fire, and that stirs up some memory. And they remember that, the best way to put out fire is with water from a nearby well, and they cash in that recollection fire and use that in a role to assemble a bucket brigade. And now they can't do that again like callbacks until there is a reflection scene. So let's talk about that next. Reflections, these are short scenes similar to tag scenes where characters take time to introspect and focus, articulating their dim memories. All recollections that have been referenced in play are refreshed. So you could get that fire recollection back. They're refreshed and available once more for that character with an additional word added to one of them. So they might have several. Only one of them is going to get an extra word. GMs may incorporate as many reflections in a session as desired, but at least one per session is advisable. So the idea is that you will have these downtime scenes of introspection and where characters are trying to work through, and it could be on solitary, on their own. It could be as a group. It could be that they're trying to jog their memory, actively in a library, reading through books, or there's some kind of montage, or it could be that they're just silently meditating out in nature somewhere. But the idea is they're trying to reach back and remember those things. And when that scene is happening, it is refreshing all the recollections, but it is also clarifying. It's adding an additional word to one of them. So now instead of fire, your recollection is house fire. Or your recollection might be fire squad. And suddenly you've taken this twist, right? Oh, that's right. The flames, the flames were like at the barrel of the musket or something, right? Like, so there's a lot of sort of free form room to play in there to help guide forward momentum of the story, but also have those backgrounds kind of being uncovered as you play as well. Because as characters in this don't actually have like a huge background. This is kind of not the standard, what is your character background? You're kind of filling that in as you go. You can have an idea, like something you're aiming for, or if you just want to kind of just play as figure it out as you play, that's fine too. But it's not like you have this 3-paragraph essay of this is everything my character's ever done. The whole point is you don't remember. Your character doesn't remember what they've done. And it may have been for a decade, it may have been for a century. That time is dependent on the table. Okay, so that's reflections. And then we have reversions. So we have recollections, reflections, and then we have reversions. And this is a non-prime trait that players choose or create that when used, it inflicts D6 stress on a character's highest rated attribute. And there's no asterisk there, but that's kind of like super asterisk because I'm not sure how I feel about that part. If you happen to read through this and have other ideas about how to balance that in a more meaningful way, I'm all ears for it. But this just feels maybe a little bit too harsh, but also I really like it, so I'm not sure yet. In fact, I think it's the most recent change I've made. Okay, so a reversion is a non-prime trait that players choose or create that when used inflicts D6 stress on a character's highest rated attribute, signifying a monstrous manifestation and or a malevolent mindset beginning to return. The trait itself functions similar to a D10 ability, which is something that broadly captures the monstrous state. Like you could have just your reversion could just be vampire or black ops assassin or rogue AI. That's fine because it's capturing all of that sort of nature of when you delve into that monstrous side of you. And it only has a single SFX attached to it that you can choose or create at the beginning at character creation. So it's kind of like an ability, but again, a little bit different, implemented differently, and it bites back with that D6 stress. So when a reversion die is added to a pool, any number of banked growth dice may also be spent to be added into that pool. So you are essentially sacrificing, possibly, if you choose to, sacrificing forward growth for reversion back into that monstrous state, embracing that monstrous nature. So a lot of the game is that dual, that dichotomy of giving in to the monstrous nature, and erasing a recollection feels like that would be a really high cost for a reversion, but that was one of the versions of the build that I had. There's definitely a way that you can see how being a monster is not just a primary struggle for conflict and drama and stuff in the stories, but also in a real sense, when you are approaching those conflicts, you can rely on that monstrous nature, but it may cost you growth in the future, personal growth. And in here, it's actually, you can actually take growth dice and spend them in your pool. And then I just added in, because it is a little bit different, the growth test to add a new SFX to a reversion. So you're not adding more traits, but you're adding more. SFX is a D8 plus the rating of the reversion die. And of course, the reversion is a non-prime trait, but it can be stepped up through growth. All right, so that's kind of the three heartbeats of what we were, right? Recollections, reflections, reversions. Sharing and caring is a sort of separate section. 3 simple mods that help with a game of what we were, helps it to flow a little more smoothly and stay true to its roots. One of the 3 is that plot points can be freely shared between characters who each have a D10 or higher relationship with each other. Okay, so this rewards that teamwork, that heavy connection or strong connection. The second is that whenever a character helps another character fully recover from stress, we talked about this earlier, they both add that stress's highest rating to their growth pool. So that's pretty straightforward. The third is that characters may help other characters by spending a plot point to lend out their corresponding relationship die for another character to include in their pool. So if I have a D6 relationship with you, I can spend a plot point at any time and you can have a D6. It doesn't matter what die you have for me. You might have a D10 for me, but if I have a D6 for you, it's the D6 that's getting shared. Okay, it's my relationship with you. Multiple characters can do this at the same time, and the die lent this way is only good for one roll. And whoever lends a die this way, so if I'm lending you the D6, I gain a growth die equal in size to the die being lent. So I'm getting growth by helping you, all right? The 3 mods allow for more focus on teamwork and growth that isn't attached to constantly rewriting trait statements. And this line is something I've had since the earliest versions of the build. Sometimes you reach a point where you just know a person. And sometimes we grow not by changing our views of those we care about, but by relying on the strength and immutability of our relationship with them. So what happened was in several of the playtests, we had trait statements on our relationships, and people wanted the benefit of challenging, but also it kind of became this issue of, well, I don't really want to constantly be changing the way I feel about someone. And so it's like, well, okay, so we'll take that out. But if we take that out, then we've cut off a big piece of the drama that I think is important to the game, especially when you can do things like create new relationships with townspeople or cities or other nations or things like this. I think the trait statements are important there as a potential fuel for drama. Yet there needed to be an outlet for players who did not want to delve so deeply into that dramatic piece. There needed to be an outlet for them to be able to grow in other ways. So what I landed on, and again, a lot of this is still in process in a lot of ways. What I landed on was incentivizing and shoring up this idea of working together and teamwork and supporting each other, so that you might have a session, certainly a scene, but it could even be an entire session that is really focused on one character, and that character is doing the bulk of the engagement with the story and carrying of the narrative, and the other characters are still able to not just support the story, but to grow in a personal way. I think of like the episodes of shows where it's usually an ensemble cast, but for whatever reason, we're zoomed in on just 1 or 2 characters throughout this particular episode. And the other characters, the other players, are able to still get a meaningful benefit from that session, mechanically speaking, right? It is still a role-playing game. They're still able to benefit from that with some growth dice, although probably not as much if they're not the lead. They're probably not actually engaging in conflict that much. But they're still able to get some. They can help with the healing. They can support in pools. So, okay. So, and then the last piece is just a sort of default character sheet, which I think if you were printing this out to use at a table, you could use this. Of course, you'd have to fill in, your reversions would have to be written kind of small and so on. But this is just mostly to have a layout of what a character sheet might look like. Obviously, I have a video on how I use Google Sheets, and that's how I typically prefer to do things, because most of my gaming is online. And I'm sure there are people who could do a much better job at this and know how to not have the little corner pieces that Google Docs always brings over from Google Sheets. But whatever, it did it to my high pressure build too. There was like the little corner cross pieces. Anyway, So really long video, and I wanted to show off something that I've been kind of working on for a long time, and as I say, some of you watching have probably helped me play test it, and I'm super grateful for that. And so it may be interesting to see how far it's come, and then also if anybody has any feedback or wants to do play tests themselves, you're certainly welcome. I'll put a link in the description. You can download this and play it at your own tables, virtual or otherwise, and let me know how it goes. If you had a good time, if you had any feedback, and if anyone had any thoughts about changes that might really hone in on that vibe of kind of waking up and realizing that realizing and reconciling with your past. Yeah, I think, or even just like some cool default settings. Like obviously you could do something like vampires or werewolves, or maybe not obviously, maybe I shouldn't say it that way, but like that's kind of the first tier of like, oh, generic fantasy stuff, which is fine. But I think you could use it for, like, what comes to my mind is one of my favorite film franchises is the Bourne films, especially the original trilogy, the Jason Bourne films, where you have this main character who is in a lot of ways playing out this build, like sort of fighting against his monstrous nature, which is what he was sort of trained to do, but he was under the power or sort of brainwashing of sort of this evil influence, evil masters, and kind of like reconciling and figuring out how does his life proceed now that he has it back, and how do you deal with the effects of what you did when you were quote unquote monster, and what does that even mean, a monster? I think those are really cool areas to explore with these sorts of stories. All right, I've taken too much of your time already, I think, fanboying over my creation. Like I said, I've been sitting on it for a long time, and didn't want to share it, and then finally felt like, okay, I think I can share it now, and just see what people think about it, and encourage you, like I say, if you have the time and you want to take it for a spin, and or make a character anyway, and just see how it works for you, and let me know what you think. That's all I have for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions and comments, leave them down in the comments. I'll get to them. I appreciate those. I appreciate all that sort of feedback and engagement. And I will see you next time. Excelsior.